Welcome back. Stories with Corrie. Here we go again. Yeah, we're just gonna jump right in and start our story where we left off with our good friend Jacob. So, and I'm gonna do something I've never tried before, so bear with me. I'm gonna tell the story, the rest of the book of Genesis, strictly from Jacob's point of view, which, if you've ever gone through Sunday school, that's not normally how we tell the story. We usually jump over and start telling one of the boys' stories, but we're just doing Jacob today. So here we go. So Jacob, remember Jacob, when we last left Jacob, he had just parted ways with his brother Esau, and it gone better than he thought it was going to go. Well, he winds up in the land of Shechem, has some struggles with the locals. His boys don't really get along very well with people. So they end up leaving Shechem, and they go south. Well, on the way, they're not too far from the little town of Bethlehem, and his wife, Rachel, remember, like, his favorite one, like the beautiful one, the one he worked 14 years for, that wife, well, she goes into labor and gives birth to a son that Jacob names Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. But in the course of giving birth, Rachel dies. So it's like super tragic, and they're like in the middle of nowhere. This is not their home country. They have no family nearby. So she's just buried along the way. Like there's a marker there, and there's a pillar that he puts up, of course, but it's not like in the family burial plot or anything. So super sad. Well, the journey continues, and they wind up down in the land of Hebron, which you may recall is where Abraham had lived, and where it was his son Isaac was still living. So Jacob is home back with his dad, has 12 sons and a daughter and a wife still. He still has Leah, and a lot of sheep. So they're raising their sheep, they're doing their thing, and the boys are getting older and older, and the older they get, the more it becomes very obvious that Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, is Jacob's absolute favorite son. Like, so favorite, he gives him this beautiful coat of many colors, and that just makes his brothers all the more angry and jealous, and yeah, it just did nothing for family relations. Well, that and the fact that he was kind of like the designated tattletale. Parents, here's a pro tip. Don't put your kids in this position. So one day the boys were out with their sheep, like way up back in Shechem, because that's where they were like pasturing their sheep, way up there. And Jacob calls his son Joseph over and says, Joseph, I need you to go check on your brothers. Just see how they're doing, and then come back and give me a report and let me know what they're doing. Make sure they're doing their thing and doing it well. And Joseph said, okay, Dad, whatever you say. So this little 17-year-old kid goes off on his merry little way to go check on his brothers. And of course, I'm sure he's hoping to find some dirt so he can come spill the tea for his dad. But anyways, he's off on his merry little way, and there Jacob is at home with his other little son, Benjamin. And before long, actually it was probably a while, but before long, he sees not Joseph returning, but his other sons without Joseph. And in their hand is Joseph's coat, shredded and covered in blood. And they ask him, they say, Dad, do you think this is Joseph's coat? Because this doesn't look good. And sure enough, he was absolutely certain that it was his son Joseph's coat, and that he was dead and had been killed by animals. So he was devastated. He was absolutely devastated. He says, I might as well just die right now. He doesn't die right now, thank goodness. But that's where his heart was. So, but life continued, and 20 years later, they're still doing their thing. By then, of course, his wife Leah has passed away, and his dad has passed away, and his sons have, grown up and married, and many of them had children by then. But 20 years later, he was still thinking of Joseph, his beloved son, and just how tragic that story had been. Well, there was also a famine in the land, so that wasn't great news for him. But they did get some news that down in Egypt there was food, and you could buy it, and you could, live through the famine and not die. So Jacob called his 10 sons over to him and said, "Sons, we really have no choice. I need you to go to Egypt and get some food and come back." So that's what they do. 10 sons go to get food, and 9 sons return. And Jacob is devastated. He says, "Are you kidding me? First, what in the world? Where's Simeon?" And they said, Dad, you will never believe it. Dad, you will never believe this. We got there, we were gonna buy food, and then we got interrogated. They thought we were spies. And this guy, I don't know who he was, but he's like second in charge, so we couldn't really argue. And he kept asking us questions, and he wanted to know if we had a dad and if you were alive and how you were doing. And he wanted to know like if there were any other brothers. And we had to tell him because we didn't want to get in trouble. So we said, yeah, there's one more son. And like, well, there were 2, but one's gone. And like, there's one more at home. And he continued to accuse us of being spies, and so we couldn't think of anything else to say. And then he said, well, the only way I can trust you and believe that you're not spies is if you bring that other brother that you claim to have, if you bring him here. But that was only after he put us in prison for 3 days. And so he kept Simeon like as collateral. So we can't go back for more food without Benjamin. We can't get Simeon out of prison without Benjamin. And Jacob was absolutely devastated, enraged, frustrated, infuriated. I don't know. He was all the things. Because he's like, are you kidding me? First I lose Joseph, and now I've lost Simeon, and now you expect me to give you my youngest son Benjamin? Are you crazy? Never. Well, eventually they run out of food. And Jacob says, boys, we need food. You need to go back to Egypt to get some more food. And they said, Dad, we told you we can't go back to Egypt unless we take Benjamin with us. Jacob said, no, you can't. And they said, Dad, we're not kidding. Like, this dude is crazy down there. He thinks we're spies, and he's going to kill us all if we don't come with Benjamin. And then Reuben steps up, Reuben, and the oldest, and he says, Dad, listen, if we have to take Benjamin, we have to. But if we don't come back with Benjamin, you can have my 2 sons. Like, it's so, like, we have no other choice, Dad. We have no other choice. And so Jacob thinks about it for a while, and finally they're starving. They have no other choice. And he says, okay, fine. I mean, what else? My heart's already broken. I'm going to die anyways. This is it. So take Benjamin. Go. So 10 sons leave, and they go to Egypt. And Jacob waits. This has never worked out well before in the past. Why would it work out any better this time around? And so Jacob waits, and he waits, and he wonders, and he worries, and he waits some more until one day he's out in the field, and he sees on the horizon a caravan, some guys, some dudes, and he counts them. There are 11. They've all returned. And he's ecstatic. All of them have returned, presumably with food, which is really good news because he's totally out and he's getting pretty hungry. But not just 11 sons have returned. Behind them is a whole caravan of Egyptian wagons and provisions. And the closer they get, the more confused he gets because he's like, I for sure did not send that many pistachios for them to buy this kind of good stuff for me. And the boys get there and they say, Dad, you will never believe it. You'll never believe it. The guy, like the crazy guy who said we were spies and accused us and kept Simeon in jail and insisted on seeing Benjamin and was wondering if we had a father and if he was in good health, that guy who ordered that our money be put back in our bags, that guy, Dad, you're not going to believe this. You better sit down. Dad, that guy is Joseph, your son, the one we thought was dead. It's Joseph. Somehow, I don't know, he wound up in Egypt and he's now second in charge of Egypt. And Jacob was just about to die right there on the spot. It says he was numb. He couldn't fathom. How could his son, 20 years now later, be second in command? Inconceivable. And yet they said, no, Dad, seriously, it's Joseph. And not only that, like, see all the stuff? He sent that. Like, Benjamin wound up with hundreds of shekels of gold. And look at us. We've got all the food we need. Not only that, Dad, but he wants us to move to Egypt. Jacob just couldn't even at that point. He could not even. He's like 130 years old. He needed to sit down. I said, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me right now, Joseph? I mean, it took some convincing, but sure enough, they convinced him, and they packed up their bags and their lives and their flocks and their families, all 66 members of Jacob's family at that point, and they moved to Egypt. And they got there, and who, of course, was waiting them in his little chariot, but Joseph himself. And there he was, waiting for his dad and his brothers and his family. He said, see, God has done a miracle. He put me in this position to save you, knowing all the while that a famine would come and Egypt would need my wisdom. And here I am. It's been a rough journey, but here I am, Dad. And look at us, we're a family again. And so they set up shop right there in the land of Goshen, like northern Egypt. And Joseph said, hey, Dad, you want to meet Pharaoh? You want to meet my boss? So Joseph goes down, or Jacob, and then takes his dad, Jacob, and he says, okay, Dad, when you meet him, just tell him that you guys like keep livestock, because they actually hate shepherds here in Egypt. So don't mention sheep or anything like that. Well, at some point in his 130 years, Jacob had learned not to lie. And so when Pharaoh said, Jacob, it's so nice to meet you. You have such a nice son. I really admire him and appreciate him. You have no idea. And he says, what do you do? What do you do with yourself, Jacob? And Jacob said, oh, I keep sheep. I just love those little sheep. And Joseph probably just smacked his head and said, oh my gosh, I said not to mention sheep. Well, turns out Pharaoh didn't care. He said, you know what? Any dad of Joseph is a dad of mine. Any friend of Joseph's is a friend of mine. You guys just enjoy the land of Goshen, bring on your sheep, raise your families, and we'll take good care of you, because I mean, our whole nation is indebted to Joseph. So we love your sheep too. So they set up in the land of Goshen, and years pass, 17 years. Jacob lives in the land of Egypt, and he's fading, he's getting older, he can't see super well, and so he calls his sons to him and says, okay guys, I need to bless you before I die. So Joseph comes up and brings his 2 sons with him. He had 2 sons in the land of Egypt, and he brought them over to meet his dad, or to be blessed by him. And Jacob is getting a little bit hard of seeing, and so he says, who are these with you, Joseph? And Joseph said, Dad, these are my sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And he brings them before his dad, and he makes sure that the oldest son is on his dad's right side and that the younger son is on his dad's left side. But Joseph forgets that his dad's name is Jacob, and it means the sneaky one. And so Jacob, when he goes to bless the sons, crisscrosses his hands so that the younger son gets the greater blessing. And he says, no, Joseph, I'm doing this on purpose. I know. But I want you to know that you, son, are getting a double blessing, because your boys are going to be counted amongst my sons. You're getting a double blessing. You're getting the birthright. And it's kind of a big deal. And so when people talk about, how like a euphemism in the future will be like blessings like the sons of Joseph, because the blessings that these boys are going to receive is twofold of what the other sons are going to receive. So just know that, Joseph, just know that. And so he continues in blessing these 2 boys, and he says to him, he says, Joseph, I never imagined that I would see your face again. And not only have I seen your face, but I'm getting to meet your sons, your offspring. Like, what? Only God, only my God can do that. And then, this is our name this week, guys. I love this. He says, the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day. The God who has been my shepherd. 147 years God has been looking out for Jacob. It's been a journey. It's been a valley of the shadow of death at times. But what a shepherd. And then later on, he gets all 12 sons together and he blesses each one of them individually and kind of casts a vision over each of their lives. And he comes back to Joseph again and he calls on more names of God. He calls him the mighty one of Jacob and the shepherd and the stone of Israel. Like this mighty one who has fought battles and defeated foes, and the stone of Israel, the one that when everything else seemed like it was falling apart, he could fall back on and build his life on and depend on, and who was ever faithful. The steadfast love, he uses that phrase a little bit earlier. He talks about the steadfast love and how even when everything seemed to fall apart, when his wives died and when he thought he lost Joseph and when his father-in-law was abusing him and when his brother was out to kill him, like all of those times, God was ever present and ever faithful. And he was the stone, like he was the one that he could build his life on. He was the mighty one who was doing things that were just absolutely inconceivable, that he could take his dead son and turn him into the second in command in this great empire that was saving the world. Like only a mighty God of Israel could do that. That is his God. Again, he's claiming him as his own. And then again, he calls him his shepherd. And who better to know what a shepherd's duties were and his traits were than a shepherd? Like how literally his entire life, Jacob had been a shepherd. Like it talks about when he was a young man in his father's house and how he was a man of the flocks. That was his job. And then he goes and works for his father-in-law for 20 years as a shepherd. And then throughout the land of Shechem and the valley of Hebron, like he's a shepherd. And then he takes his whole flocks and brings them to Egypt. And he's still a shepherd. Like that is his identity. And yet he recognizes that he's actually the sheep. And God is the shepherd, the one who's been looking after him and bringing him to greener pastures. And when you think of shepherd, you always think of Psalms 23 when it says, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. And thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. And thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and my cup runneth over. I might have missed something in there, but that's the gist of Psalms 23, like the most famous chapter in the whole Bible, arguably. The Lord is my shepherd. And how many times was he led beside still waters and brought to pastures and the valley of the shadow of death? And yet God walked with him through all of that. And he brought him before the table of he thought he was going to die by Esau, and yet there was reconciliation. And here he was in Egypt, in this land that, they hadn't been on the closest of terms, and yet here he was in the presence of my enemies. Like I'm living in the land of Goshen. Who would have guessed? And his cup runs over. The blessings that Jacob could never have foreseen, that he would have 12 sons, many grandchildren, and he witnessed the compounding of God's promise that was given to Abraham, continued in Isaac, and continued to flourish in the life of Israel. The Lord is my shepherd. So I don't know why, I just absolutely, this is one of my favorite exclamations, is Jacob calling God his shepherd. And that was it. he says goodbye, he blesses his 12 sons, and he gives up the ghost. He goes, I don't know, the euphemism is something like he was gathered to his people. And before he died, though, he requested that he not be buried in the land of Egypt. Like, he didn't want to live there. He's like, nope, take me back. Take me back to where Leah's buried, where Isaac and Rebecca are buried, where Abraham and Sarah are buried, because that's the land that's been promised to us. So take me back. So he dies, and sure enough, his sons have him while he's embalmed. They're in Egypt. They have to embalm him. So they embalm him, and the Egyptians, like, mourn for him for, like, 40 days. And then weep for him for 7 days. The Egyptians weep for him 7 days. Wild. And then they have this whole, like, posse, retinue, I think that's the word. And they go back to the land of Hebron, and they bury him there with his family. And that is the end of Jacob. Okay, one more thing before I wrap this up. I know this is a longer video than usual, but jumping ahead, a good close to 2,000 years. Pretty famous passage in the book of John. It's a famous claim of Jesus. And he's famous for saying a couple of, like, I am, and then, like, fill in the blank in John. But he says this: I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He also says right before that he came that we could have life abundantly, like our cup running over. And then he continues again and says, I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold, Gentiles like myself. And I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. So just like Jacob could claim that God was his shepherd, we as Christians can claim that Jesus is our shepherd as well. And he laid down his life for us, just like a good shepherd would. And his sheep know his voice. I mean, there's books written on this, so I'm not even gonna scratch the surface on this topic. But I just wanted to connect those dots for you guys, that not only was Jacob was the first one to recognize that God, the Almighty God, Jehovah, God, El Shaddai, God, that God was his shepherd. But thousands of years later, or close to it, Jesus was making the connection as well, that the same God that looked after Jacob as a shepherd is the same God that is still looking after his people like a shepherd. And that embodiment of love and sacrifice and shepherding was Jesus himself. And so we too can make that connection and that claim that God, Jesus, is our shepherd. And he came so that we could have life abundantly. So if you're thinking wow, Jacob, what a story. Oh my gosh, he did some crazy stuff. Who would have guessed? The way he worked and reconciled and protected and provided and inspired and blessed, and who would have guessed? And it's not because Jacob was perfect, because I'm pretty sure we've illustrated at that point. He was not perfect. He was a sneaky skunk sometimes, but God made a promise to his family and to him, and God is the God who keeps his promises. And he is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. So he is a God who's continued to make promises that he will give us peace that passes all understanding, and just so many blessings. So I could, again, rant on this for days, but I wanted to make sure that we made the connection between God, Jacob's God, the Almighty God, his rock and shepherd is the same God that we serve today. And Jesus makes that connection himself, that he is the good shepherd. So I hope, anyways, going forward, that is an encouragement to you, like, and a good reminder to you, that maybe you can see yourself in Jacob's story of his journey of like mistake after mistake and trying to do it in his own way and not making his faith his own, and just putting his affections in the wrong things, and his hopes in the wrong, and just a whole slew of bad choices. And yet God was faithful, and he was ever his shepherd. And we, like sheep who go astray routinely, are still led back continually by our gracious and good shepherd. Okay, I'm really gonna stop now. But again, I hope you guys continue to read the word for yourself and find that hope and joy and peace and comfort and care in our Heavenly Father, who really does care for us like a good shepherd. So, all right, well, that's all I have for this week. Catch you again next time. And we may be starting a new book of the Bible. Look at us moving along. Okay, well, peace out. Talk to you again soon.